Okay, thanks for having me today, Lower Merion. My name is Julie McWilliams, as Rachel mentioned, and I'm first and foremost the niece of one of your fearless leaders here in the English department, Dr. Jean McWilliams. As Rachel mentioned, I'm also a humble graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania. But before that, and a few other things in between, I was you, but at a lovely little institution down the road that many argue has one of the most unique, if not the weirdest mascot in the Central League, the Ford car. When many of my friends say that they quote-unquote hated high school, I never really share the sentiment because in spite of its questionable mascot choice, I had a blessed childhood in Haverford Township's public schools. I played in the band, I sang in the choir, they let me write really inappropriate editorials for the school newspaper. I was a choral member in some of the plays. I learned how to cut and edit film and after-school programming. The course selection guide at my high school took about an hour to read, and one could graduate with enough AP credits to significantly trim down the first year of college. I also played a couple of sports. You have no idea how long this took me to find. I was trolling the interwebs for about an hour trying to find one of Kobe dunking on some poor Haverford kid, but I couldn't find one, so this one will have to do. Is this a tradition that continues now? Lower Merion spanking the Haverford Fords every year? Yeah, I thought so. My brother says it is. So when I was invited to come here and speak to you today about the future of public education, to say something hopeful or inspiring about it in 15 to 18 minutes, I was at first really overwhelmed. And then I thought, public education where? You, like me, go to Lower Merion High School, one of the top funded school districts in the state of Pennsylvania. Figures range every year, but on average, suburban districts spend about 1.5 to twice as much per pupil as districts where I do my research, just a few miles down the road in Philadelphia. So the question for me as someone who studies urban education policy is not what's next for places like Lower Merion or Haverford, but for districts plagued by vast socioeconomic, historic, and racially textured inequalities. Districts suffering from perpetual budget crises, staffing instability, declining school infrastructure, and extraordinary student poverty. To give you an idea of what I mean by vast, Philadelphia's poverty rates are about 7 times those of districts in the greater metropolitan region, about 36 versus 5% respectively, like in places like Lower Merion and Haverford. And with extraordinary poverty comes extraordinary student needs. About 12.2% of Philadelphians live in deep poverty. That means incomes below half of the federal poverty level. 60,000 of the 185,000 people living in deep poverty are children. Philadelphia is the poorest big city in America, and the poverty rate among children at large is 40%. Children that live in deep poverty oftentimes don't have enough money for running water, electricity, heat, or rent. They're hospitalized more often. They come to school hungry or malnourished, and they oftentimes lag behind academically as a result. Neighborhood violence also leaves them particularly vulnerable. About 67% of Philadelphia's children report some sort of trauma, according to a recent study by Drexel's College of Medicine. So when the media belabors a crisis in public education, they mean a crisis in our cities where poor folks, disproportionately of color, largely reside. And why is that? Very simply and very crassly, the way we spend money in the United States on public education is based largely on the distribution of local taxes. Low-income districts that have less money coming in through tax revenue must rely very heavily on state and federal spending budgets for education in order to supplement their own budgets. Places like Philadelphia, where about 48%, almost half of its budget, comes from federal and state funding sources, is very vulnerable when there are cuts in state and federal funding for education, like there have been in recent years. I won't rename the administration. So crassly and ironically, the districts that need more for the kids living in deep poverty have increasingly less money to spend. Here's a picture of a neighborhood high school where I conducted 3 years of my dissertation research. As you can see, there are water and mold stains etched on the walls. This is a product of a collapsing roof where chasms in the ceiling stream water every time it rains or the snow melts. The entire 4th floor of the building is sealed off due to asbestos contamination. Many of the teachers, students, and administrators that I work with there suffered and were hospitalized for aggravated asthma. I'd never had asthma in my life, but during my time there, I was suffering from some asthmatic symptoms. The school had also seen a very steep decline in its enrollment over the course of the last decade, going from a school of about 1,200 students to less than 600 students between 2002 and 2012. It had also seen a disproportionate enrollment of students that are high needs, like English language learners, so first-generation immigrant students, and also special needs students. With the building on the cusp of its 100th birthday, the school was considered a failure and placed in a pool of considered schools for closure. The characteristics I just described to you provide a historical roadmap to over a decade of extreme education reform in post-industrial cities across the United States, including Philadelphia. 13 years ago, Philadelphia became a laboratory for high-stakes testing, charter schools, and the privatization of public school operations. Declared a failed district in 2002 by No Child Left Behind testing standards, the school district was carved up in partial to be run by private companies called educational management organizations, EMOs, charged with the task of turning around failing schools. Charter schools, or kind of privately managed schools that receive public money, also doubled in number from 40 to 86 from 2002 to 2012. The principles behind these reforms reflect what one of my mentors, Dr. Leslie Bartlett at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, refers to as the marketization of public education, or the embedding of business-oriented principles into education policy, public school operations, and also discourse and conversations around the purposes and aims of public education. Principles like market, deregulation, competition, and stratification were seen as a means by reformers to increase efficiency, accountability, and namely, school choice in Philadelphia's public schools. These were also kind of market-based fundamentals in themselves. Why these ideas seem intuitive, as they're kind of omnipresent in the public sector at large. Their mapping onto public goods like education has been less than clean. The district currently faces a $1.35 billion budget deficit, driven in part by kind of these mass cuts in state and federal funding for public education in recent years, but also due to the massive expansion of charter schools. As I mentioned before, charter schools have doubled in number over the course of the last decade, and they've drained district schools of over 50,000 students, as many students that used to attend district schools have now opted to attend charter schools. This has created large seat vacancies, and the district estimates that for every student that leaves a district school in favor of going to a charter school, they lose about $7,000, as the district must maintain the fixed costs of district schools, like heating, teachers, utilities, et cetera, and they must also pay out per student to the charter school to educate them. Okay, this has placed an enormous strain on an already struggling district. For the district is now essentially maintaining two separate educational systems, the charter school system and the district system. In order to kind of deal with the fiscal instability caused by this reform, the district decided to close 30 neighborhood schools between June 2012 and June 2013. Philadelphia joined 70 other mid and large-sized urban school systems that have opted to close schools in the last decade, as they've increasingly embraced the charter sector as a way to kind of enhance school choice, bring greater efficiency to the system, and also deal with the fiscal instability induced by the Great Recession. New York, DC, and Chicago have all closed schools en masse over the course of the last decade, and also concurrently with Philadelphia in 2012 and 2013. However, displacing 15,000 students from neighborhood schools across the city, this reform raises controversial questions, not only on the effects of the communities that no longer have public schools in their neighborhoods, the effects on the communities in which this policy has come to bear, but also the precarious direction of education reform in the city at large. My school was almost one of those closed schools. As I mentioned before, it was placed on a school closures list in 2011, and my job while I was at that school was to trace the school's response to not only the school closure threat, but also the pressures induced by what one of my other mentors, Dr. Maya Bloomfield-Cucchiara at Temple University, refers to as the urban education marketplace. You see, the way the school closures process worked was that it treated schools like businesses. Schools that didn't produce the right performance data were considered failures and placed in a pool of considered schools for closure. Okay? Here's a picture of the school closure methodology, or the way the district evaluated which schools should be closed and which schools should stay open. So as you can see, building quality was one of the metrics used to measure school quality, so just how good a shape was the building in. Academic performance, so test scores. I'm sure everybody here is familiar with those. It's a big deal in our Marion too. Utilization, enrollment, how many kids are at this school? How much is it costing to keep the building open given the maintenance it needs? And very importantly, climate. How safe is this school? This is something you'll hear a lot in education reform and in urban education specifically. So in and out of school suspensions and also violent incidents. My century-old school suffered from perpetual maintenance problems, some not so great test scores, and as you saw before in the graphic, some really steep declines in enrollment over the course of the last decade. Administrators and teachers attributed these drops across the metrics to kind of the creaming of better students by charter schools, a trend that had significantly reconfigured the educational landscape in recent years as charter schools were kind of cropping up around this particular neighborhood school. With no help financially to renovate the building and with the continued likelihood of continuing to serve high-need students like English language learners and special needs students, given that they weren't kind of getting into charter schools, my century-old school saw building quality and academic performance as variables that could not be improved upon. So what they tried to do was they focused on enrollment and climate, so getting the school more kids and making it safer. And the way the school did this was that they tried to brand themselves. Okay? They tried to make themselves over into a school that was worthy of remaining open under this methodology. Bastos and Levy write that at the root of all branding activity is the human desire to be someone of consequence, to create a personal and social identity, to present oneself as both like other people, to belong, and unlike other people, to stand out, and also to have a good reputation. The way that my school created a valuable school brand was through a series of strategies that really relied on the enrollment of first-generation immigrant youth, ELL students. So when I see ELL and I say Asian and I say first-generation immigrant, those are all pretty synonymous. They perceive these students as having better behavior, that they would improve the safety of the school. They also perceive that they would increase enrollment by building the entire curriculum around these students in order to entice more students to come. So it's that reputation piece, right? They also try to minimize the enrollment of students with disciplinary issues. So kids kind of coming from their schools that had been kicked out. And the problem with these strategies was that they were heavily racialized. Asian students were seen as the saving grace of the school. These students at the school wanted to build their brand around. And African American students were seen as endangering the brand, and therefore the school wanted to distance themselves from these students. This is not politically correct, by the way. Here's a quote from a school principal that I worked under. There were two. This is just one of them. In a lot of ways, you have to market your school. You have to brand your school somehow. I think the school became more positive, safer when we strengthened the ELL program. I think the kids were happier, and therefore the kids came back. I mean, I'm in charge of a $5 million company as principal. I'm the CEO. I need to build pride in the school as the resource provider and the brander. These things were done to improve school climate and keep us safe from closure. So I said to the kids, look at what I'm doing for you. To the staff and the press, I said, look at what we're doing for each other and what we're building. I brought in the student union, and they went out and said, look, ours is a good school, and here's why. When you have the kids selling the school, it's tougher to close it. During my time there, the demographics of the school shifted dramatically. It went from a school of about 54.7% African American to 25% African American, and the inverse was true for the Asian population. It went from about 25% to 51%. While there are a few other factors and practices that went into this besides just the branding of the school, I don't have time to go into those today, but what I did realize was that this school was acting like a business, created through a series, in this marketplace, created through a series of policies like high-stakes testing, school closures, and namely school choice. This business did what it had to do in order to survive. Okay. We've shifted in our cities from looking at schools as public goods that should be available to everyone to commodities that should be consumed. When faced with the threat of closure, both principals, the teachers and students, saw themselves as forced to brand the school as one worthy of remaining open by selectively admitting and treating students well that they believe would improve the school's performance. They relied on heavily racialized notions of risk to the school's brand, and therefore they excluded students that they thought would hurt the brand's image. I want to leave you with a series of questions that I'm grappling with right now, and I think really connect to this idea of imagining a way forward. I think that before we can imagine a way forward, we really need to closely examine under what line of thinking the status quo is currently being produced and implemented. Education reformers 15 years ago saw markets as a way to improve school quality, and choice. In other words, to use markets as a way to empower our most marginalized citizens. I don't want your parents to think I'm trying to make mini Marxists out of you, because I don't think my Aunt Jean would ever really hear the end of it. But I want you to question whether market-driven models and the provision of public goods is an equitable way forward. Here are some questions for chewing. Why is public education working in places like Lower Merion and Haverford? What kind of public populates our imagination when we think of good public schools? Do market-driven policies improve educational outcomes and experience in public schools, or do they exacerbate and/or reproduce existing inequalities? My research suggests that when schools are forced to compete like businesses, they act like businesses. They minimize risk to their performance in order to survive in the marketplace. Is this how we want our public schools to operate? It's an open question. It's not one that I have the answers to and that people in education reform across the board are really struggling with. So while I don't know the answer to these questions that I just posed, I'm just figuring it out like everyone else. What I do know is that reimagining public education is very much connected to the way that we reimagine the social, economic, and civic life of our cities where many of our poorest citizens reside. I've today tried to provide a glimpse into what's going on in Philadelphia, a city close to us in distance and in heart, and also demonstrative of trends in post-industrial cities across the United States. I hope this talk provides a starting point to perhaps question the current way forward, to have a question we're spreading, not just an idea we're spreading, and possibly, with a little bit of your help, imagine a new way forward.